So I'm Prince. This is my PhD dissertation defense, and I'm here to talk to you about magnetic field mapping for indoor aerial navigation. Okay, but first I want to talk about a few cool other things that I've done that aren't going to show up in this presentation. So I worked on a cool project with Dr. Matthew Romano on using a bunch of drones to lift a common object, which was awesome. Me, Matt, and another lab mate called Jeremy worked together on simulated wildfire mapping in California. But before I started doing any of this drone stuff, I was working in a spacecraft lab. And the very first spacecraft that I worked on went into space in 2016. The second one that I worked on went up in space in 2018. And this is me. This is a selfie of me in the solar panels of our spacecraft before it went up. And the last one actually just went up like 3 weeks ago. It entered orbit in December 29th of 2022. So the work that I'm presenting today is kind of really a beautiful marriage of both the spacecraft knowledge that I've gained and how to apply that to vehicles down here on Earth. So I want to talk a little bit about navigation and how we find our way when we're moving on Earth. The main thing that we use is GPS, which we basically triangulate with a bunch of satellites in space. And we can also kind of use the same technology with cell towers. And some applications like this one will use both. My work focuses on GPS denied navigation. When you don't have access to GPS, the game changes a little bit. And people will use things like fiducial markers, where we'll put these things that look like QR codes up around the workspace that we have and use those to help us navigate where we're going. We can also do things called feature-based tracking, where we're tracking like edges and corners, like you see on this zebra stripe here. And as these features move over time, we can use that to figure out how we are moving through the space. There's also methods of spatial mapping where we want a better understanding of what's going on in the entire room. So here you see this monitor and then a more close-up version of it. And the algorithm is able to track that it has seen this monitor before and now it is closer to it and use that to help figure it out. Also, there's spatial mapping with things called point clouds where you get really dense understandings of the space around you. The last type of mapping I want to talk about is signal mapping. So this is an example of kind of like the GPS thing, but instead using like Wi-Fi routers. And if you know the location of the Wi-Fi routers in a workspace, you can use the intensity of how far they are to help you figure out where you are in a room. The last example of signal mapping that I'm going to bring up is magnetic field mapping. And similar to the Wi-Fi router thing, there's also a magnetic field in this room right now. And if we start to make maps of it, we can start to help it, we can use it to help us start understanding where we are within this space. So that's really what I focus on, is I do GPS denied navigation with magnetic fields. The reason I do that is because of this idea called sensor fusion, where you want to have different sensing modalities in case one of them starts to fail. If I'm using a camera and it suddenly gets very dark and I can't see anymore, I want other sensors to be able to help me move around the space. There's a very common type of sensor called an inertial measurement unit, and it has three components: a gyroscope that tells me how fast I'm spinning, an accelerometer that tells me how I'm moving, and then a magnetometer that tells me where magnetic north is. IMUs are very common, they're very cheap, they're on your cell phone, they're on most microprocessors these days, and they're literally everywhere. So the really cool thing about this is that magnetometers and IMUs are all over the place. We have magnetic fields everywhere on Earth, but magnetic fields tend to be pretty underutilized in terms of navigation. We don't see a lot of papers and applications using it to help us figure out where we are. And that's what I'm trying to change. So the core question that we're trying to answer here is, can we improve the use of magnetic fields as a sensing modality? And I'm going to focus on IMU-based applications so that my methods can be accessible to others. Also, we want to ask, how valuable are magnetic fields for GPS-denied navigation? We want to be able to figure out our position and attitude in the workplace that we're in. And we also want to be able to know when these tools will be useful and when we should probably use other sensing modalities. What difficulties arise from using magnetic fields? If you've ever worked with a magnetometer, you might know that electronics tend to make it a little unfun to work with. And also magnetic fields are hard because they're unintuitive to us as humans. We can't see or feel the magnetic field. So when it starts doing strange things, we don't have a good way of checking that work as easily. The way that I'm going to do this is by collecting real experimental data and then validating every method that I test. I could have simulated a lot of this, but it's actually really hard to do that because there's not enough research yet on how we should be modeling indoor magnetic fields. And I didn't want to start making assumptions that were not appropriate for real life applications. So I just cut to the chase, got the data, and started analyzing it from there. Okay, so that's the high level idea. My work kind of breaks down into three separate chapters. The first chapter we're going to talk about is how to make these indoor magnetic field maps. The second chapter is we're going to take those maps and use them to estimate our attitude in indoor spaces. And then the last one, we're going to take the same maps and use it to help us figure out where we are in a room. The main contributions of my work, there have been a few. First, it's kind of cool that I've gotten to bridge together my spacecraft and UAV mindsets. A lot of the initial inception of the ideas that came out in this dissertation started because of how we do this in space. It's very common to use magnetic fields to help you figure out where you're pointing in space, but we don't really do it here on Earth as much, especially when we get inside. And it was really just me kind of bringing those two mindsets together, which was fun. I made a lot of contributions to our lab's autopilot, or C-Pilot HAssist, and this was very necessary for us to get the experimental work done that I had to do for this work. And then I've flown my drone so many times. Like, I'm a little obsessive, and when things don't work, I want to understand why, and I always collect more data and analyze more and more until I either find the answer or I get tired. But yeah, there's also a couple other things that I've done here on campus that aren't going to show up in this work, but like, that's fine. And the innovations, the things that I've really done that are new is I've applied Gaussian process regression mapping to this new thing called compromise maps, which I'll tell you more about in a little bit. I've made a cool 3D visualization of magnetic field maps to help them be a little more intuitive to people. I've come up with a new signal to noise ratio metric, which I think will help us understand how accurately we can figure out our position. And then I came up with this thing called a consistency metric, which I use to try to indicate when the magnetometer is helpful and when we should maybe use a different sensing modality. Okay. So let's talk about the first chapter. How do we make these maps? So what is a magnetic field map even? So the idea is for any location in a workspace, I want to be able to tell you what the magnetic field looks like anywhere in that workspace. So the magnetic field really has three components to it, an X, Y, and Z components. And then my space, the space that I'm working with, the volume that I'm in also has three components. So I like to refer to these as P to M maps, where P is the spatial input dimension and M is the magnetic field output dimension. I make 3-3 maps because I have a drone that can come off the ground and move in all three dimensions. When I'm making the map, basically what I do is I take my UAV, I fly it around my lab in like this lawnmower pattern to collect a bunch of observations, like at these red points. But what happens when I want to know what's going on here between observations that I have, but I haven't really been to that point before? What I need to do now is a thing called interpolation, where I basically use knowledge of the observations that I've gathered around and to help basically fill in the gaps of what I don't know in that spot. There's a bunch of interpolations techniques that exist, and it kind of depends on how many dimensions you're moving in. So if I'm moving down one axis, like in a hallway, it's common to use like least squares and linear interpolation. If I'm moving in 2 dimensions, like on a floor, there's this thing called bilinear interpolation, but it's kind of restrictive because you have to have like a very specifically defined grid of measurements. And I didn't want to do this grid-based, observation stuff because that would just make things take more time. Gaussian process regression has been used by other works in 2D where they will map the magnetic field of a floor. And once we get into 3D, like full volumes, it tends to be the only thing that's left for these signal-based mappings, at least for magnetic fields. So we learn from the existing works and use Gaussian process regression, or GPR, as our method to interpolate the magnetic field. Now, the math of this is a little fun, so hold on with me for a second. Gaussian process regressions, they will output two things that are important. One is the mean, or the average estimate, and the other one is the variance, or how confident it is in that estimate. In order to get that, though, I have to compute a few terms related to this kernel called K. And the kernel that I use is called the square exponential kernel. And basically all this is a similarity function. It's comparing two locations and it's telling me how similar they are. And if they are more similar, then it will use observations from nearby locations to help me predict somewhere that I haven't seen before. I will collect a bunch of observations called training points, and then I will compare my query point, the place I'm interested in, with a bunch of prediction points. So kind of stepping through this a bit more procedurally, first I fly my drone at these locations. The big X here is the location, and the big Y is the magnetic field I measured at each of those locations. I will then take those observations and use them to optimize the hyperparameters, which are part of the kernel that I talked about a moment ago. And once I have my kernel trained on the training points, I will be able to query a point that I haven't really seen before and use the kernel to compute similarity weights between these red points and this new location. Finally, my Gaussian process is able to give me the estimate of the magnetic field there and how confidently it believes that estimate is. Okay, so to make my maps, I have to gather observations. I gather observations with my UAV, unmanned aerial vehicle, or I tend to refer to it as a drone a lot. My UAV is equipped with some sensors. There is an IMU, which has a gyroscope and accelerometer that I sample at 200 hertz, a magnetometer that I also sample at 200 hertz, an altimeter that I sample at 4 hertz, and some motion capture cameras that give me at least 100 hertz of ground truth data. The total sensor cost for these IMUs, magnetometer and altimeter, is like $60. So I'm working with very low cost things because a lot of this has just been like me trying to extract value out of things that are already in our lab that we already have, and not trying to buy a $2,000 gyro to come up with a solution. So yeah. Okay, so overall, gather observations, go in the lab, take your UAV, gather observations, make your magnetic field map. You're good. Congratulations, you did it. Thank you for coming to my talk. Okay, so when I tried this the first time, I ended up getting measurements that looked like this, where this is the X, Y, and Z components of my magnetic field. And basically when I was moving along the long axis of my map, I got very noisy measurements that looked like this. When I moved across the short axis, the noise quieted down a little bit. And then when I moved back down on the long axis again, it got noisy again. So effectively, aggressive maneuvers in my UAV were creating magnetic field noise that were making it very hard to accurately map the room. What's going on here in a physics kind of perspective is that I have a battery that's providing power to my UAV. And most of the power, most of the energy is going into the motors to spin the propellers that keep my UAV in the air. Now, as electricity is going from the battery over to the motors, there is a magnetic field that gets induced around the wire that is carrying. And it's this induced magnetic field that is causing a lot of the noise on my drone. And basically, the noise gets worse when the motors need more power when I'm moving faster, and the noise quiets down when I don't need as much power. So since the motors are the most power expensive thing on my UAV, maybe changing the commands that I give to my motors will help decrease the noise. The way that I give commands to my motors is based on this thing called a cascaded PID controller. So basically, if there's a position that I want to go to, like in front of me, then to get from here to there, I have to move by some velocity, which becomes this next step in the chain. That change in velocity, for my drone at least, is associated with me changing my attitude. I have to go from hovering level to pointing forward in order to get forward velocity, which becomes a new attitude command. And now to go from level to pointing forward, I have to change my angular rate, which becomes this step. The total output of all of this is a set of motor commands that go to my UAV. And I have sensors that help me estimate the current state of my UAV, and I feed that back into the whole chain. Now, most of this doesn't matter for this particular part, but the specific part that is very important is this angular rate controller. These three letters, PID, are associated with three terms that my controller is working on. A proportional term that just takes the error and multiplies it by a gain. An integral term that takes the error, integrates it over time, multiplies it by a different gain. And a derivative term that differentiates the error and multiplies it by a third gain. And it's this part here, the derivative gain, that was causing most of the issues. Because when I have my actual gyroscope data, which is part of this error, this is what that data looks like during a normal flight across the three axes. And you can see that it looks pretty noisy. This is because when my propellers are spinning, my drone is just vibrating like all the time. And the gyroscope is reading all those little vibrations as changes in angular velocity, which is like true, but not helpful. But when I start taking derivatives of this noisy signal, it ends up giving commands that are very chattery, and it gives very high frequency commands to my motors that are causing the noise that we were seeing. So effectively, the derivative term of my angular velocity controller is causing a lot of this noise. But there's a second actor here, where it's also dependent on the amount of energy that's going in, right? Because when I'm flying a bit slower, the noise tends to go away. So there's really two levers I can pull. I can try to make my drone fly slow all the time, which is boring, and it also just makes things take longer, and I don't like to be boring. So, so what I did instead is I adjusted the controller. And these were the original gains that I started with. And by just removing the derivative gain entirely, I was able to decrease the noise pretty significantly. So overall, by adjusting the controller gains in my system, I'm able to reduce the amount of induced magnetic field noise and get cleaner measurements. Sick. Okay, so now we have clean measurements. Let's make some maps or something. But I want to talk about consistency really quick, because ideally, if I take my drone once, like this black trajectory, fly it around, land, and make a map, it should give me the same map as when I fly later with this blue trajectory. And I want to make sure that that's true before we go on forward. So what I did is I flew my drone in this trajectory many times, and I basically paired off the flights. For one flight, I would use data from one flight to train my map by optimizing these hyperparameters, and then use the other flight to validate how accurate the map was. I will tell the map to predict what's going on at the locations at flight B and color those as blue, and then take the actual measurements from flight B and color those as red. And now we have measurements that we can compare in the X, Y, and Z axes and see how accurate our map is doing. It's a little hard to compare these lines when they're like this, so I actually like to plot the error of the red and blue lines in the block.
Hey, Prince, before you get too far into your results, there's a question.
Oh,
I
I'm sorry.
use the square snake path for gathering samples. Are there theories on optimal sampling paths? This is a question from the Zoom audience.
Yeah, so a lot of the other works that I've seen tend to use these square snake paths. They also don't really explain why. But the reason that I did it is because it's easily repeatable, and it also gives me parameters that I can adjust. Like I can adjust the distance between these swim lanes that I call them sometimes, and then start to do analyses of how close or far apart my points need to be to get accurate maps. So for me, these rectilinear trajectories were helpful to do those sorts of density analyses. And it also lets me do things very repeatably. I can tell my drone to just fly this trajectory every time, and then basically start to do consistency tests like what I'm talking about here. Oh, cool, good question. Okay, we paired things off, red and blue, take the difference of the red and blue, and that becomes these black and gray plots here, which is the error. Where you can see the x-axis tends to agree pretty well and has low error, but the y and z axes have very poor agreements between just 2 flights. I didn't even wait like an hour. I just flew it like back to back, and things are already a problem. It's wonderful. But this is just one example where sometimes it's a little different, where things will be bad and then it just gets good. And this is really the heart of why this problem is difficult, is because sometimes even midway through a flight, the induced magnetic field will change character in a way that makes it difficult to just account for in post-processing or anything. And then sometimes I pair off 2 flights and the measurements are wonderful. And if this happened every time, my life would be so easy, but like, that's fine. That's what a PhD is. It's supposed to be hard. So, really the problem here is that like things are changing every time that I fly my drone, which is not good. There is another source that it could be. Maybe it's not my drone doing it. Maybe the magnetic field in the room is just changing every once in a while, right? Well, what I did is I put my magnetometer in my workspace. I just left it there for actually months. But here's like 4 hours of that data. And you can see that the components barely, there's a lot of noise here, which is kind of my fault. But if you look at the main signal, it's not changing by more than like 0.2 microtesla. Whereas the differences that I'm getting between my flights are like 1.6 microtesla. So I really don't think it's the ambient field. I really think it is my UAV introducing this noise. That's the problem here. This type of noise is also frustrating because it varies with time and it doesn't have a zero bias. It's not just like a distribution where I can talk about it as a zero mean Gaussian and deal with it with common estimation techniques. Because it changes with time and it's not zero bias, it's a little more difficult. And I tend to refer to it as flight by flight variations. The root cause of this, I don't actually know. I spent like 6 months last year trying to investigate this pretty thoroughly, and I just could not figure out why. But there is literature that exists that tells me if I move my magnetometer further away from my components, my electrical components, things should get better. So let's see if that works. I put my magnetometer, this black box, on a bunch of standoffs at a distance s away from the rest of my electronics. And I vary this from 2 to 8 centimeters. And this is a plot where I have data from 2, 4, 6, and 8 centimeters. And on the vertical axis, you see basically how much variation there are between pairs of flights. And when my magnetometer is pretty close to my electronics, there's opportunities for up to 2.5 microtesla variation, which is like just really bad. But as I move further and further away, the flights become more and more consistent with one another, which is very helpful. However, this only happens up to an extent because you don't really see this error going down to 0, which is what I would like ideally, for each flight to really just give me the same measurements every time. The way that I'm going to try to address, the reason I think this is happening is because there's still that induced magnetic field that's happening and it's different every flight, but I'm only training my map on one flight. So whatever is happening in that one flight, I'm telling my map that this is all that exists in the world and it doesn't have knowledge that there are these varying biases in other flights. So what I'm going to try to do to fix this is incorporate data from more flights with a method called compromise mapping. Now, I realized earlier that I kind of made these slides in a little bit of a confusing way because I to you why this error isn't going to 0, because we don't have enough data for multiple flights. And ideally, what I would show you is data on how I train for multiple flights and reduce the error, basically reduce this variation. I forgot to make those slides and I didn't realize that until this morning. But you'll have to take my word for it that I did this and it was able to reduce the variation, but it came at a cost of increasing the runtime because now I have more prediction points that I have to compare my new query point against, and that just takes more time to process too. The way that I fixed that problem is with this thing called compromise mapping, where I just got a bit smarter about how I'm choosing my prediction points. And now I can have the reduced variation, but also a lower runtime. Now, I don't have slides to show you this transition, so I hope that that's okay, but I am going to talk to you about how I was able to reduce the runtime by being a bit smarter about picking my prediction points. So this is back to the math that nobody likes, but the important things here is I collected data to optimize my hyperparameters, and then I had a set of prediction points. Before, these two were the same, but now I'm going to train my hyperparameters on data from multiple flights so I can learn what's going on with the time-varying biases. And then use hand-selected, I will pick a set of N1 prediction points throughout my space and fix the size of these at about 500. So it doesn't matter how many flights I'm using anymore, the time that it takes to query will be fixed by however many query points I've selected a priori. There's some terminology that I'm going to use here where the intermediate map is going to use all of the data that I have from all the flights, and the compromise map is going to use just the points that I've told it that it's allowed to use. Both of these maps are going to optimize the same hyperparameters over several flights, so those aren't different. The key difference is that my intermediate map is going to do prediction on a bunch of data, and my compromise map is going to do predictions on from the locations that I told it to. But now the big question is, because I'm reducing the amount of prediction points, is the error for this map going to be worse than the error for that map? We want to make sure that it's still accurate and not getting worse just because we're making it faster. So to test this, we're going to go back to the lab, take our drone, and fly it around a bunch of 3D trajectories this time. And I need to mouse to make this video play. Okay, so these trajectories, there's some that go at the lower altitudes, some that go at the higher altitudes, some that span, like they try to split the space into upper and lower sections, and then kind of another split, but a bit more inwards. And I'm going to repeat those again. So there's kind of like an inner split of measurements, an outer split in purple. There'll be 4 upper trajectories here in orange, and then 4 lower trajectories in blue. So I have 4 different flights that are kind of going to the same locations in my workspace. And this is important because now at some altitudes, I have 2 flights of data that are able to teach my map what's going on at those locations, even though one of them might have a different time varying bias and the other one will have a different one. The map can start to learn about what's going on with the general field by comparing all of those measurements. Overall, there are 2001 colorful dots in this space, and I will take those 2001 points and use it to train my map. But now I'm no longer just overfitting to one flight, so this problem should go away. Again, I don't have slides to show you that, but you have to take my word for it. So what we are going to compare, though, is that I want to know if my intermediate map using 2000 points has a similar accuracy to my compromise map, which will only be using 500 prediction points. And I'm going to validate those both against a bunch of test flights. The way that validation looks like, again, is we have blue lines for the estimates of the map and red dots for the actual measurements that were taken during that flight. But this is hard to track, so we're just going to plot the error. And on the right, I'm going to show you the error or the accuracy of my compromise map. And on the left, the same accuracy, but for the intermediate map. And what we see here is qualitatively, these 2 plots are pretty indistinguishable. Like the error stays low, there's a few outliers in both cases, but like it's pretty much the same. And quantitatively, which you can compare by, I plot the root mean squared error in the title of each plot. And if you compare those left to right, there's never more than 4 nanoteslas of error. And 4 nanoteslas for my application is like minuscule. Like that would be great if there was only 4 nanoteslas of error, let me tell you. So this is good that my compromise map using less data is just as accurate as my intermediate map. And here's another example where you basically see the same thing. Qualitatively, they're the same. The difference quantitatively is about 3 nanotesla.
Hey, Prince, before you move on, there's a question from a few slides ago that I just didn't want to interrupt you for.
Yeah, what's up?
Can you talk about the possibility, or did you consider using Springman's work on magnetometer calibration in the presence of time varying currents, where Springman was from Professor Kuevor's
Yes,
lab?
we did think about it, but so for those who don't know, there is this work from Professor Cutler's lab where they did magnetometer calibration, but they had a bunch of sensors of the electrical current on the vehicle. And they were able to use those measurements of the electrical currents that were inducing magnetic fields to offset the noise that the magnetometer was measuring. I know about that work. I used part of that work, but I couldn't use the time varying part because I don't have electrical current sensors on my UAV. And I didn't want to add some because I'm stubborn. So that's fine. But I mean, like actually, a real reason, like it does take time to, add new sensors and things like that. And not every UAV is going to have those sorts of sensors. So I kind of, again, was going the route of just let me work with what I have and did this compromise mapping thing instead of the time varying calibration. So yeah, good question. What was I saying? Yes, compromise map, intermediate map, same accuracy, wonderful. I did this across 4 additional validation examples, and the max error that I saw was 13 nanotesla between the compromise and intermediate map, which was very good. And my compromise map is able to run a bit faster because it has fewer prediction points. If you're familiar with big O notation, the prediction part for a Gaussian process regression is big O of n squared. So we can really drive this query time to be much slower by reducing the number of prediction points. Okay, so in summary, for my first chapter, we started with noisy magnetometer data, and we fixed it by adjusting motor controller gains. Cool. Oh, no. Hold on. I do this thing sometimes where I jump to a slide, to the ending slide, because the end button is next to my arrow. So I have to go back. Okay, high frequency magnetometer noise we fixed with adjusting the motor commands. There is this time varying bias that was annoying, but we addressed that. We made it better by moving my magnetometer further away from my electronics. There was still some variation that was left over, and I was able to reduce this. Again, I don't have a graph, sorry, by adding data for more flights and using the compromise map technique to keep the prediction time pretty low. The last thing that I introduced here was this visualization technique, which is really nice because if you think about the first time you learned about the magnetic field, you were probably given like a needle compass and told that it was pointing wherever magnetic north is. So I tried to take that intuition and bake that into this visualization technique where these black arrows is where a compass would be pointing if you were at that location. And you can actually see that the direction that the magnetic field is pointing is changing quite a bit just as I move up and down or across a workspace. The last color that you see behind each arrow is the direction and magnitude that the magnetic field is pointing into the ground. Because the magnetic field doesn't just happen on the plane, it's a 3D vector. And here in Michigan, it tends to be mostly pointing into the ground, pointing north a little bit, and then not really moving east or west. So I'm hoping that this visualization technique will help magnetic fields be a bit more intuitive to people and a little more approachable to use. So that's chapter 1. This hasn't been published yet. It's almost done. We'll submit it soon, and then you can read about it more later. But it's also in the dissertation if that's your life, if you want to do that. Okay, so attitude estimation is what we're going to do next. We're going to take these magnetic field maps and start estimating attitude. The way that we do this outside is by making 2 assumptions. 1, that the magnetic field is not changing as we move around, and 2, that the magnetic field is generally pointing towards north. Both of these assumptions tend to hold pretty well, which you can see from this map that I made of a field outside of here. When we get inside, both of those assumptions start to fall apart though. The magnetic field is not pointing anywhere near north, and it's changing everywhere we go. What this ends up meaning is that people don't really use the magnetic field for attitude estimation or anything really when they get inside. But the reason for that is that it becomes difficult to do indoor attitude estimation with just an IMU when you don't have full knowledge of the local magnetic field. So we're going to try to solve that, but first I want to tell you how I estimate attitude. The tool that I use is something called a multiplicative extended Kalman filter, or an MEKF. It's a special flavor, if you will, of the Kalman filter family. And the thing that I'm going to estimate is the attitude and gyroscope bias. And that's going to be my state X. And my Kalman filter is also going to give me a covariance, which is a measure of how certain or uncertain it is. MEKF has 2 steps. It has a prediction step that I use with my gyroscope and a correction step where I use my accelerometer and my magnetometer. For the prediction step, basically I'm taking my gyro data, which again tells me how fast I'm spinning, and I'm integrating that forward in time to tell me how my attitude has changed. The way that it does this is with math that tries to respect the constraints of attitude space. A normal EKF will try to linearize and tell you that you're moving in a straight line, but attitude really is motion like on a circle or a sphere. And that's what this multiplicative extended Kalman filter is doing a little different from a normal EKF. It's trying to respect the constraints of angular motion. And then I update my uncertainty, which tends to get higher based on how noisy my gyroscope is. The next important thing that I do is I take my accelerometer and my magnetometer, and I use that to adjust my attitude estimate. What I start with is an expectation or a reference vector of both the magnetic field and the acceleration. I take that expectation and I compare it to the real measurements that I got from my magnetometer and my accelerometer. And the difference between this expectation and reality is what I call a residual, or epsilon. And I can use those residual terms to update both my attitude and my gyroscope bias as I'm going along. When I do this, I will also decrease my uncertainty based on how accurate my magnetometer and accelerometer are. And I use this term called a Kalman gain, which tells me how much to adjust my estimate based on how confident, how much I believe these sensors, basically. If you didn't follow that, it's okay, because what I want you to focus on is this idea of a reference vector or the expectation. What I expect from my accelerometer is for it to measure gravity, which is pointing straight down basically all the time. But this gets a little difficult when I start moving my drone around, because now I have accelerations left and right, up and down, that aren't just gravity. With my magnetometer, I'm expecting it to measure magnetic north, but it gets a little difficult when I'm in indoor spaces and the magnetic field is changing everywhere I go. So the core question that we want to investigate is, do my magnetic field maps provide good magnetic reference vectors that allow us to do good attitude estimation indoors? The follow-up question to that is, does the answer to this first question depend on how much the magnetic field is changing? Is it more useful to do this when the field is constant, or is it more useful to do it when the field is changing a lot? So to test that, I'm going to do flight tests outdoors and do flight tests indoors and compare the results. There are 5 trajectories that I fly my drone in when I'm doing this. The first, flight profile A, goes around like the perimeter of my workspace and hovers at each location for a little bit before moving on. Flight profiles B, C, and D are all types of circular trajectories that move at different tangential speeds or at different altitudes. The last flight profile is E, where I oscillate up and down in the x-axis for about 90 seconds, and then left and right for 90 seconds. And the goal of all 5 of these flight profiles is to be able to have different attitude maneuvers that I'm making my drone do, so I can see how well I'm estimating my attitude through these different maneuvers. The results for this are summarized in this table, where I have the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 flight profiles for each header separated by vertical lines. And within each major column, there are errors for the roll, pitch, and yaw. Now, each row is giving me a different source of reference vectors. WMM is a world magnetic model, which is basically a low resolution map of the entire world. It's not actually low resolution, but basically if you ask it for the magnetic field anywhere in Ann Arbor, it's going to give you the same value. So everywhere in my workspace outside, it's just telling me the same thing. It's assuming the field is constant. And so I made my own constant field, assumption by taking my own measurements and saying this is also a constant field. The last source of reference vectors is my full Gaussian process regression map, where everywhere my drone is, I'm going to ask the map what the reference vector looks like and compare that. The bolded values are the lowest for each column, and what you end up seeing is that it's not really clear who's doing better. The winner kind of bounces around depending on if it's roll or pitch or depending on which flight profile. And this means 2 things. One, the constant field assumption is pretty good. Like me adding the full map isn't really doing anything better than just assuming it's constant. And what that really means is that my map isn't really needed outside if you want to do attitude estimation. It's perfectly fine to just assume the field is constant and work with that as your reference vectors. But when I get inside and I compare assuming that it's constant to checking all the time, we really see that using the full map is winning all the time across all flight profiles for roll, pitch, and yaw. And it's just not appropriate to assume that a magnetic field that looks like this is constant everywhere, because it's just not. But my map is able to give you good reference vectors that enable you to do good attitude estimation.
Hey, there's a question on chat. What is the attitude resolution of mocap?
It's good. Yeah, I actually don't know. It's smaller than anything that I've thought to worry about, but I don't think I've ever quantified it. That's a good question that I don't actually have like a numerical answer to. But yeah. Cool.
So I want to jump in a little bit and just say, it depends on where you put the motion capture targets.
That's true. Yeah.
Maybe you could explain that instead.
Hold on. Wait, I think I have assistance from a friend.
Okay. Ask a friend. You're using this point now.
Oh, so I was asked what the position accuracy is of motion capture. Oh, and that's like millimeter, like 1 or 2 millimeters for the indoor flight space. For outdoor flight space, it's a little more, maybe like up to 10 millimeters.
So you can now answer this question because you have millimeter. Yes, this
Yes,
is a
that's true. That's true.
defense, yes.
We
uh-huh.
have millimeter accuracy of the position, and based on the spatial distribution of the markers, I could figure out what the attitude estimation error is. But yeah, there's that. But like that's how I would solve this problem. I don't have the numbers in my head to do it right now. But yeah, that is a better way to answer the question. Thank you. Like I agree. I agree. That is a much better answer to give than I don't know because I have something and I could derive it. But yeah. Okay. Am I off the hook? Am I good? Okay, she's not saying anything.
No, I had mute on and rushed to press the button. So I've put a note in chat, quote,
Okay.
Prince will put this result in his dissertation.
That's a good thing that Prince should do. I like that. Okay, so let me summarize the attitude estimation stuff really quick. So we use this thing called a multiplicative extended common filter to estimate our attitude using just IMU data, and we were able to show that our maps improve the reference vectors that we get. The amount of spatial variation determines what solutions we use, because when we're outside, we don't really need these maps because they're just kind of unnecessary. Assuming the field is constant is great, but when we get inside, we really need them for accurate attitude estimation. This paper was published in 2021. It's in a journal called Sensors. It's pretty cool, so go check it out. Okay, so the last, oh yeah, what's up, man? Yeah, so Ben from the audience asked, would flying near power lines change my assumption of the constant magnetic field? And the answer is kind of, because what I'm mapping here is the DC magnetic field, which is direct current, but there is also an AC magnetic field based on what frequency you're looking at. And because the US power grid oscillates at 60 hertz, I would expect the magnetic field that you see near power lines and other electrical things like that to be in the 60 hertz frequency. I don't know if the power from the power line would also change the DC magnetic field, but I would expect it to change the AC magnetic field. But because I'm doing this with just the DC magnetic field, the answer is I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, cool. Okay, published. Go check it out. Fun stuff. Position estimates. We take the maps. We figure out where we are in a room. It's wonderful. Let's talk about it. So what I want to do is basically use the spatial variation that I have with my indoor maps and use it to help me figure out where I am in a room. The reason that this is hard outside is because no matter where I move through this space, I'm basically going to get the same measurements. So it makes it really hard to tell if I'm just standing still or if I'm moving 10 meters or not when I'm measuring the same thing everywhere I go. But with the rich spatial variation that I get in indoor spaces, if I'm over here, the signal looks very different than if I'm on this side of the room. And I can start to use that to help me figure out where I am. So intuitively, we would expect more spatial variation to give us more accuracy, but I want to check that quantitatively. So what I'm going to do first is define what I mean by spatial variation and come up with a metric for it, and then compare that to my accuracy of position localization. The way that I define spatial variation is with the gradient of the magnetic field. Basically, I want to see how the magnetic field changes as I move over some short distance. This is a kind of 2D snapshot of one altitude of my magnetic field map. And I kind of want to use it to talk about the gradient in the room that I have. So if you kind of look just going vertically up and down, the direction of the arrows nor the color in the background change very significantly. So basically what this means is if I'm looking at the gradient in the x direction, it's going to have very small values, which I'm plotting here for the x component's gradient. However, if I'm moving left and right, there tends to be a lot more change, which I can plot here as the y gradient. Similarly, when I'm moving up and down, there's a lot of change, but it's a little hard to see that with this single altitude slice. But with this little video here, you can kind of see that the magnetic field is changing pretty significantly at different altitudes that I have in my workspace. I'm going to play it again because I like this GIF. It makes me happy. Cool. So yeah, and what's happening really is that like in kind of this like bottom left corner of my highest altitude, that's where the biggest change is happening. And at other locations, there's smaller change. But if I'm moving in the x direction, it doesn't really matter where I am. There's very low gradient. It's not going to change much. I can summarize these three metrics as one metric, which I call the norm of the gradient at this altitude. And what I want to do now is design trajectories that help me understand and answer this question: how does spatial variation relate to position localization accuracy? So this is the gradient norm at the lowest, the middle, and the highest altitude in my workspace. And what we see is that the highest gradient happens at the highest altitude, and the lowest gradient happens on the right side of the lowest altitude. I'm going to use this knowledge to design some trajectories in my workspace, where I'm going to put a red dot at the highest gradient spot, and then design a trajectory that moves in the x-axis moves in the y-axis, and moves in the z-axis. So that gives me 4 trajectories around my high gradient spot. I'm going to repeat that same idea with the lowest gradient spot. So in total, I have 8 different flights that allow me to understand what's happening at the highest gradient and allow me what's happening to understand what's happening at the lowest gradient position in my workspace. So that's the spatial variation side. Now I want to talk about the position estimation side. And I use a tool called particle filters. And what this is I'm basically keeping track of a set of particles or different hypotheses about where my vehicle is in the space that I'm moving in. I'm going to represent these particles as red circles, and the workspace is this very colorful background that I have. Each particle is going to have a state estimate associated with it, which for me is a position and velocity, and a parameter W called its weight, which is a measure of how credible that particle is. Basically, how accurately is it reflecting the real UAV's position, is what the weight tells me. And there's 3 steps to my particle filter. Step 1 is I take my accelerometer data and use it with a process model and use that to integrate my estimate forward in time. I started with these 6 dots down here, and based on my accelerometer data, it tells me that I'm generally moving in this direction. So I'm going to move all my particles this way, but I'm also going to add unique noise to each of them so that they're not all clustered on top of each other. I want a bit of diversity in hypotheses, so I'm not just getting 10 things that are telling you the exact same thing, like, oh, all 7 of these are wrong. That's not useful. So, okay, so that's my process model step. The next step is the measurement model, where I take my magnetometer data and I just measure it. And I say, hey, what does the magnetometer look like where I am right now? And we're going to depict this as this little colorful square where it's a little green on the left and purple on the right. Now I'm going to use my measurement model with all of my particles and have it tell me what each of these particles would have measured if they were at that location. And that looks something like this for some of them. Now what I want to do is compare what my actual measurement was to what each of these would have measured if they were at that location and use that to update my weight. This is how I'm going to measure how credible each particle is. It's basically how well does it reflect the actual measurements that I'm getting. The ones that reflect this well will get higher weight, and the ones that don't reflect it well are going to get much lower weight. Now, the third step is called resampling, which is sometimes I have particles that aren't doing much for me. They are hypotheses that I know are bad, and I want to replace them with better hypotheses. So what I'm going to do this every time the effective number of particles gets too low, below some threshold that I define. And I'm basically going to take these ones and resample 6 new particles, where most of them are going to be near the ones that have high credibility, and we're not really going to put new particles near the ones that we've decided are useless for us. More procedurally, I do this process model at 200 hertz every time I get new accelerometer data to move my particles. I do the measurement model to evaluate the credibility at 200 hertz as well whenever I get magnetometer data. And then I resample every time I start having too many particles that are not useful for me, and I just want to make new ones that are more useful. Okay, so spatial variation, particle filter, gradient, position estimates. Now I want to talk about how the position estimates, which I will put as error terms here, compare at different spots in the room. Remember, I had 8 trajectories, and here I'm comparing the 2 hover trajectories where I'm just holding the position at this high gradient spot, and I'm also holding the position at this low gradient spot. And what I see is this is plotting error, so lower is better. And I get lower error when I have higher gradient. Higher gradient means lower error, which is good for when I'm hovering. When I'm moving in the X direction, though, I get lower error for the lower gradient, which defies my expectations a little bit, but I'll talk about this in a second. When I'm moving in the Y direction, again, high gradients, low error, sweet. And again, in the Z direction, high gradients, low error. So the hypothesis seems to be holding. The more gradients I have, the more information I'm able to extract, and the better I'm able to estimate my position. This exception is not because of the gradients in the room, it's kind of my fault. What you end up seeing here is the red line is what the ground truth, what actually happened, and the blue line is what my particle filter estimated in the X, Y, and Z direction. So basically what happens is I'm moving up and down in the X direction, my Y direction is constant, my Z direction is constant. But what my particle filter thinks is happening is it thinks the altitude is changing a little bit, and it also isn't going as far in the X direction as what the drone actually did. It kind of keeps diverging from the ground truth, coming back to it, and diverging and coming back to it. Ooh. And the rate of this happening is identical to the rate of the error in my magnetic field map. Basically, my map has errors in a certain part of the room, and every time the drone goes into that part of the room, my map is giving it inaccurate information. The particle filter gets confused, it does the best that it can, but the best that it can is not really correct. And so what you see in this table is a number that's higher than it would be if I had an accurate map. This isn't because of the gradient, it's because my map is inaccurate, and I wasn't able to solve all the problems that I talked about in the first chapter. Okay, so typically higher gradient, lower error, good. Life is good. I want to also analyze this in a different way, because remember I talked about how the magnetic gradient in the x direction is lower than y or z, well, there should be trends for that as well, right? So instead of just plotting the total error, I can plot the x, y, and z components of my particle filter's error as well. And if this hypothesis holds true, what we should see is the number in this column here should be higher than the numbers in the two other columns. Sometimes it's the same, like x and y error are the same, and then it gets lower. But for the most part, we are seeing that the x error tends to be higher than the y or z error, which seems to line up pretty well with our hypothesis that we have here. There is one exception. Yeah, this is just saying in math what I said in words. Cool. There is one exception here where the error for the y is actually higher than x. And so what I did is instead of showing you the gradients at the highest altitude, I'm showing you the gradients at the altitude where this trajectory is taking place. And the hovering is happening kind of like in this right edge where I'm like circling a little bit. And what we see is that the x and y gradients and z gradients actually are all pretty dang low for this location. This is the lowest gradient spot in my room, so it's not that surprising. But I think what's happening here is that like, there really just isn't much information that you can get from x, y, or z, so it's not super surprising to me that y ends up being a little higher than x here. I don't think this disproves my hypothesis. I think there's just such little information that one can extract when the gradient is this low. That's what's going on here. Okay, so last way I'm going to analyze. Oh yeah, what's up, Rex? Yeah. Where there's high gradient? Yeah, so I have 8 flights and they're all paired off as a high gradient and a low gradient case, right? So there is a trajectory that's like moving up and down, for example, through the lowest gradient spot, and there's another trajectory moving up and down to the highest gradient spot. Is that into?
Look at the estimates as like a subset where the color
Oh, like up here? Okay. Oh, I would, yeah, okay. So the question is like, I think what you're asking is, should I expect lower accuracy here than if I was here? Is that kind of what you're asking? And the answer is yes, I would expect that, but I didn't specifically fly my drone there to check. What I did though, is I flew it at this altitude where I went to this very hot section, and I flew it at this altitude where I went to this very dark blue section. And I just compared those two. Does that make sense? Yeah. Cool, 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 cool. Okay.
Hey, Prince, online questions.
Yeah.
Could you give a sense of the expected error using only the accelerometers? And part 2, or an indication of how much improvement is obtained by adding the magnetometers?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So what the question was asking is, why don't I'm showing you the position estimation error when I've combined accelerometer and magnetometer data. And it would be helpful to have a reference where I only use the accelerometer, so I know how much the magnetometer is helping from just using integrations to the accelerometer. The reason I did not do that is because using just an accelerometer on a drone that's vibrating all the time is actually like not very good data. I guess I maybe should have and could have shown that with numbers, but like the position estimates just become very bad almost immediately. And it was just like, this is garbage and I don't like it. So like, I mean, this is not I'm being a little facetious, but really what is going on is like, there's this thing called dead reckoning, is when you just take your inertial measurements and you integrate that over time. And that's what you would be doing with just integrating the accelerometer. And that's normally not good, even if you have decent measurements. But specifically on my drone, because there's just so much vibrations, the accelerometer data is like even harder to work with. And so doing just dead reckoning is just like, it doesn't end up being accurate at all. And so I kind of started the baseline with having just the magnetometer data. And I had another comparison where I added the altimeter, but I'm not showing that in this presentation just for time. Does that answer the question? I think so. I hope so.
I think so. There was no other response, so thank you.
Okay, cool. Okay, so what I've been doing so far is I've been taking like 2 minutes of flight data and I've been condensing it into like a number, or 4 numbers really. And I'm doing this with a thing called root mean squared error, where I'm kind of averaging all the error over time. On top of that, my drone, at least for 6 of the trajectories, is moving through regions that have different amounts of magnetic field gradients. And I'm also kind of condensing all of that into one number by saying high gradients or low gradients. So basically what's going on is I'm kind of averaging over too many signals and condensing this analysis down to like high or low, like, good or bad. What I should be doing maybe is looking at each point in time, the gradient that is at this specific location, the error at that moment in time, and compare them. The way I'm going to do that is with a thing called the signal to noise ratio, which is not always how this term is defined, but the way that I'm defining it is with a signal term based on the strength of the gradients, what we've been talking about, and a noise term based on how wrong or inaccurate my map is, because the error isn't zero, so I have to account for that somewhere somehow. And I'm going to compare the signal to noise ratio across each timestamp of all my flights and compare that to the particle filter estimation accuracy. The blue dots here are the, so what you're seeing here on the horizontal axis is the signal to noise ratio metric, which is basically the amount of gradient that we get. And the vertical axis is the accuracy of my particle filter. The blue dots here in this graph are when I'm hovering at the lowest gradient, and the red dots are when I'm hovering at the highest gradient. I can do the same thing for the X stride, where red is high gradient, blue is low, the Y stride, and the Z stride. And overall, what I end up with is a trend where as I increase the amount of gradient or the signal to noise ratio, error typically goes down, okay? There's some anomalies to this where you can see this flight in blue, where I have higher gradient points that also have pretty high error. So that's one thing that's problematic with this metric. The other thing that's problematic is that when I have low gradients, sometimes I have low gradients, low error. Sometimes I have low gradients and very high error. So this metric isn't like one-to-one mapping. It's not going to tell you if you have this number, you're going to get this error. And it's also kind of hard to work with because it's kind of sometimes giving us an upper bound and it's sometimes giving us a lower bound. So this is my attempt at coming up with a metric that will let us predict how accurately we might be able to estimate our location, but it's definitely not perfect yet, and it's going to need some more work. But overall, it is showing the trend that we expect. As we increase the amount of gradient or information we're getting from the field, our error is going down. So to summarize, we want to compare gradients to, the way I define spatial variation is with the magnetic field gradient. I use a particle filter to estimate my position. I fly a bunch of trajectories, analyze things, and I find that the gradients, typically higher gradient means lower error, which is kind of what we intuitively expected, but it's really nice to have like quantitative analysis that backs them. Also, I defined this new signal to noise ratio metric that is going to hopefully in the future help us predict how accurately we can estimate our position using magnetic field maps. This paper is also not done yet, but hopefully later this year it'll be published and you can check it out more later. So just to wrap everything up, the vision here is to really just get more out of what we already have. We already have IMUs on a lot of devices. There's already a magnetic field in every room waiting for us to use it. And we just need to start becoming more comfortable with using magnetic field maps so we can improve our ability to navigate indoors without having to add a bunch of equipment in our rooms, like putting fiducial markers everywhere or getting really expensive hardware on our vehicles. The way that I did this is by making magnetic field maps using Gaussian process regression to interpolate and using a UAV to get those observations, but also there was a lot of challenges when I had a robot gathering the things for me because it introduced some noise. Also, I wanted to show how these maps are valuable, not just that I can make the maps. So I compared their usefulness in attitude estimation and their usefulness in position estimates. Here's a few publications that I have lit. Moving forward, what I want to do is investigate the magnetic field biases, those time varying biases I talked about. I told you I couldn't figure out what it was. Maybe a future student will be able to do that, hopefully. We'll see. Not me, though. That's not me. I also want to add other sensing modalities, right? Because the whole idea here was sensor fusion. I'm not trying to propose that you should only use magnetic fields. I'm just saying you should stop ignoring your magnetometer. But what I want to be able to demonstrate is that this can also benefit other sensing modalities. But to do that, I need like a camera or a LiDAR on my drone to be able to show the comparison when I'm adding the magnetic field and when I don't have it there. There's also AC magnetic fields, alternating current that I talked about a little bit with the power line question, and electrical grid is at 60 hertz. So I show you maps of the DC, direct current magnetic field, but if I made a map of the AC field at different frequencies, it might start to look different. So we can basically start to pick up features that look different in the DC domain than they do in higher frequencies. And maybe that will improve our ability to move inside by, again, just using the same sensor, just in a slightly different way. Lastly, this is a map of like the anomalies and the Earth's magnetic field over the entire planet. This is from the World Magnetic Model map that I was talking to you about earlier. And so like if I'm just in Michigan, there's not really that much of a change. But if I'm moving very large distances like across the country, I can maybe start to use this to help figure out where I am. Where I think this might be most useful is in orbit determination, because when we're in low Earth orbit, our spacecraft are going to circumnavigate the globe in 90 minutes. We're moving like 8 kilometers a second. And I think that's an application where we're moving fast enough and we can see enough change, even though this is, changing pretty slowly over large distances. The spacecraft are moving fast enough to where they might be able to pick up on these changes and use that as spatial variation to figure out where they are in orbit. Okay, that's all the technical stuff. Now I get to thank people. This is fun. Okay, so my committee members, Professors Atkins, Cutler, Ghaffari, and Moldwin, they've been wonderful. It's been great working with you all over the last few years. Yeah, I like the stuff that I do. It's really cool. It's very fun. And it's really been from their guidance that I was able to put this together. I have a lot of friends. Oh gosh, I have a lot of, I've gotten to make a lot of friends here on campus, which is really great. And I've learned a lot from getting to lead student groups like Black Students in Aero and GoSTEM, Operation Graduation, and just like playing volleyball with my pizza calzone friends. It's been great. You've made this experience wonderful, and I love you for it. I've had a lot of help from my lab mates. I specifically want to call out Dr. Dae-Young Lee, who was, when I was an undergrad, he was a PhD student. I was working under him. And I think the experiences and knowledge that I got from him really led to what I'm doing now. And Dr. Matt Romano, who started his PhD at the same time I did when I started working in the drone lab. And those were some of, honestly, like my favorite parts of my PhD was collaborating with you. So thank you. And also there's just like really awesome staff and faculty on campus that like you can just start to like dream up whatever you want. And there are people here that will help you make it happen. Like, presenting in this room right now was like a fight that the staff had to have on me and Michael's behalf. And we're like really grateful that you all have done that for us. And lastly, so I want to thank my family. Stop laughing, it's not bad. Yeah, so I want to thank my family, my mom, my sisters Christiana and Mally, my dad, and my older sister Princess. My older sister's not here right now, but it's not been easy doing this because like stuff at home's hard. And it's hard in a way that's been really difficult because sometimes it made me feel like me pursuing this has kind of taken the oxygen out of the room a little bit. And that's affected my mom and my younger sisters a lot. But I'm really grateful that you all have supported me and been the wind in my sails to get this done, because it's not easy to begin with. And it's hard when I always felt a little guilty, like I was cheating you a little bit for being here. But thank you for supporting me. And yeah, that's all. Thank you for listening. To me, it is a gift to lend a patient ear, an open mind, and a critical eye. So it really means a lot to me that you all are here listening to me talk about weird magnetic field things for like an hour. So yeah, thank you.